Hello, everyone, and you're very welcome to another episode of narcscon with myself and Remy. Today, I would like to read out a very beautiful piece of prose and writing written by one of our community. And it signals spiritual awareness through the physical senses. It's like a spiritual message being translated to a person's spirit and soul that they can see through a visual, a visual presentation or representation of what they're reading in a spiritual sense. So there is a part of the story that people may find, I'm not listening to this anymore, it's too fantastical. But if you understand somebody who is very much in connection with their sixth sense, I call it, sometimes our brain translates what we're actually seeing into a different picture that makes sense to our spiritual intelligence. That's the best way I can put it. So if you would like to listen to this story, it's a true story. The names have been changed. And thank you very much to the person who sent it in. And I would like to say there are so many wonderful people in our community that actually signal to me that the presence of good is stronger than the presence of bad. So without further ado, I will get into the reading of this amazing story, and so well written. I hope the person goes on to write more because it's very impactful. And before I get into it, can I ask you for your help? Can I ask you to like, share and subscribe? It keeps us here. It helps us a lot. Thank you for that. The other thing I wanted to mention was I received a donation recently and I couldn't reply. I didn't have the capacity, the allowance to reply to the person to say thank you. So you know who you are. Your name starts with M. Thank you very, very much for what you sent me. So now I'm going to put the glasses on, so there might be a bit of a glare. I'll try not to look up too often with the ring light. The piece is called Estrangement. Peter sat across the table from his birth mother, Helen, in a coffee shop in a busy city centre on a dull and rainy Wednesday afternoon, listening to her chat, nodding and smiling in response. Helen had given Peter up for adoption when he was 2 months old. 25 years later, she had traced him down through a private investigator, in brackets, not strictly speaking a legal avenue to follow. Initially requesting a meeting through Peter's adoptive parents. At that time, Peter had wanted to meet her, hoping that such a reunion might clear up some of the mysteries he had long struggled with regarding his biological origin. For many years, despite a very loving upbringing with his adoptive parents, Peter had pondered unanswered questions, such as why he had been adopted in the first place, what were the reasons behind it, who actually were his biological parents, whose traits did he share. He had never met anyone with whom he shared a genetic heritage. Such identity issues are not uncommon among adopted children. I'm going to preempt this by saying, and this is a generalization, but if you have a narcissist, oftentimes narcissistic parents who do give their children up for adoption, later in life, when they need additional narcissistic supply, they will come looking for their children in relation to additional supply and a kind of an ownership domain of their children. Again, please don't misinterpret this as people searching for their children or adoptive or children searching for their parents. This is an entirely different matter. I'm just pointing out the narcissistic element of this so that it may resonate with somebody. Although he desired answers to these questions, he felt overwhelmed by the prospect of seeking his birth mother. And so he was somewhat relieved when the incentive was taken by her instead. He readily acquiesced to the prospect of a reunion, which was set in motion with minimal intervention on his behalf. All he had to do was provide his consent to be contacted by her, which he did through his adoptive parents. After the initial meeting, Helen and Peter managed to broker and maintain a cordially respectful, if relatively distant and informal, relationship. Their get-togethers settled into a steady routine where they would meet up 2 or 3 times annually, as on this occasion, usually around birthdays, when cards and small token gifts would be exchanged. For many years, however, Peter had felt a growing sense of barely suppressed unease in his birth mother's company. The urge was becoming inexorable and intolerable within him to find a way of avoiding her company altogether. Unfortunately for him, he resided in close proximity to Helen, who lived in a neighbouring town to the city where he was based. Endlessly inventing credible excuses to dodge these rendezvous was becoming even more onerous and difficult. He couldn't just keep inventing ploys, pretending he was ill or otherwise engaged, and the habit of lying in itself was becoming a nuisance to his conscience. He felt the situation was reaching breaking point. Oftentimes our gut will tell us, there's something wrong here, I'm not comfortable, this is taking too much from me, it's not a good experience. And it's very hard when we don't know about narcissists to pinpoint what exactly that could be. And I'm quite sure Peter, I know the names have been changed, Peter felt some type of a duty to meet his mother after she had reached out. So there's a lot of things going on here. Peter's unease stemmed from the fact that he had become convinced from extensive first-hand experience over many years that his birth mother was a covert, malignant narcissist. Okay, so you did have the knowledge about narcissism, so some of the things were beginning to make sense. A lot of people don't. He wasn't a trained psychologist, but having conducted his own research into personality disorders, he found an uncanny parallel between Helen's character and NPD, narcissistic personality disorder. He could cite numerous examples that corresponded with the diagnosis. Her lack of empathy, manipulative tactics, gaslighting, delusional grandiosity, compulsive lying, blame shifting, and playing the victim card, her litany of broken relationships, too laborious and tedious to list individually, her sense of entitlement, her outbursts of childish lying, blame shifting, playing the victim card, her outbursts of childish petulance, and so on ad nauseum. Simply being in her presence, even on these rare occasions, had become completely exhausting and depleting for him. You've really listed the traits, the main traits of a narcissist. So you observed all of these things, and you did have some knowledge of what a narcissist was. I apologize. I said prior to this I didn't think that you did. So you did have knowledge of what a narcissist was. A lot of people wouldn't, and would be kind of wondering why they get this uncomfortable, stressed feeling when they have to meet a certain individual. It's often an energy-sucking vampire that's actually a narcissist. Okay, he felt like he was being sucked dry by an unwelcome parasite, a leech, a tick, using him as a host and draining his emotional resources, his life force and his energy. But what was additionally exhausting for him was that all of these seemingly obvious blatantly offensive behaviours were delivered in short, sharp shocks, small nips, drawing beads of blood. And so they, sorry for the noise in the background, and so they were never overly easy to spot. Excuse me, Remy, would you just mind being a little bit quiet? Thank you very much. I don't know if that'll last. Sorry for the interruption. Okay, let me find my place again. Before one had registered the offence, Helen would change tack and reverted to a pleasant manner, which had the effect of making one question whether anything untoward had even happened in the first place. So narcissists read people very well. So they get out the nasty bit, and then if they're not getting the response they want, or they think that the person is on to them, they suddenly become all nice again. Or they really give out about somebody, and then suddenly, they kind of, oh, well, I feel sorry for them, really. Like, I'm a good person, and I know they're really nasty, but I feel sorry for them. I'm a great person. That's the kind of thing that may have been going on. Okay. The practice was so unnerving, it led Peter to question his own perceptions of her behaviour, even reality itself. Was he being delusional? Did the fault lie with him, harbouring a repressed resentment and animosity towards her for giving him up? A subconscious grudge that created a non-natural bias in him. He sincerely thought that he felt a genuine gratitude towards Helen. After all, despite everything else, she had literally given him the gift of life. And this sense of gratitude is what prevented him from decisively terminating their bond. It's very confusing, particularly this type of relationship dynamic. And as with all normal human beings and empathic people, we introspect and say, like Peter did, is this really my fault? And do I really resent her? Is this what's causing the issue? Like, what am I actually witnessing here? Is it my fault, or is it real, what I'm witnessing? Am I putting a bias on it? Another serious disadvantage for Peter was the fact that he had no meaningful relations with any of Helen's friends or relatives. He could not consult any neutral third party about her to glean an independent opinion. What piqued his suspicion was that Helen had either broken up and fallen out with countless close family members, former friends, and even professional partners. She constantly complained to him about this, and her direct openness about these breakups seemed to suggest that she had nothing to hide, of course. All of those breakups and all of these disagreements were nothing to do with her, which would be a very narcissistic take. This left Helen in complete control over all of these narratives, able to decide what Peter knew and did not know in all of her affairs. Peter felt totally isolated by this situation, unable to exercise a balanced judgment with opposing testimonies. Over time, this distortion of truth became more and more warped and disorientating, like an ever-growing black cloud overhead, veiling him from the light of clarity. And again, when we meet a narcissist that we don't know, they're able to spin the narrative, and we don't really have a point of reference if they're a total stranger. While he obviously felt a natural obligation to sympathise with Helen, the sheer number of broken relationships, which only gathered and mounted over time, raised a red flag that became increasingly impossible to discount or ignore. Of course, there was always the narrowest chance, the slimmest possibility, that she really had been merely an innocent, unwitting victim in all of these cases over the years. But if this was really true, then she'd had the most spectacularly improbable run of bad luck for decades on end. Such things happen, but Peter instinctively felt that the truth was buckling being stretched to its absolute limit, and that eventually something would have to give. With all of these pent-up feelings stewing and bubbling under the surface, Peter sat listlessly, stirring his coffee, half-heartedly listening to his birth mother, putting on a brave face, when his attention was suddenly drawn to her pair of dark brown eyes staring at him from across the table in the cafe. There was something horribly amiss, something uncannily wrong with them, something he had never seen before. But what on earth could it possibly be? There was nothing obviously abnormal about his birth mother's facial appearance, and so he focused more carefully. With an appalling shock of recognition, he saw something revolting and hideous beyond his wildest imaginings. The dark brown circuits of Helen's irises were slithering and squirming with what appeared to be tiny, wriggling, writhing maggots. These legless, worm-like larvae were initially difficult to spot because they were the same colour as her irises. In fact, they almost seemed to be part of her irises, which was incredible. With grim fascination, Peter peered closer. The maggots were crawling in and around, over and under one another, burrowing hungrily, feeding greedily upon some source of vile nutrient within Helen, some bounty of intrinsic filth. Peter blinked his own eyes in disbelief and looked again, hoping that the putrid vision was a hallucination that would quickly pass. It did not. Instead, he saw even more detail than before. An oily, slick sheen glistened on the surfaces of Helen's irises, as if the sticky, fetid heat of the maggots in motion was making the irises sweat. But what were the maggots feeding on? Peter suspected he knew all too well, but could not bring himself to admit it. This is an incredible description of spiritually aware vision coming through the physical sense. But there was yet more. Peter's attention was drawn to Helen's jet black pupils, which were no longer merely the circular centre of her eyes. They were jet black jewels of adamantine, I'm not sure what that word is, I look it up, adamantine pride, stubborn, unyielding, utterly void of tenderness, compassion, gentleness, love, or mercy. At this epiphanic moment, Peter grasped why hell is depicted as an endless, eternal inferno. For only infinite fires burning with everlasting intensity can disintegrate, corrode, and ultimately melt down this hardest known substance of absolute, unalloyed pride and arrogance that is so unwilling to ever concede its position, to ever admit that it is wrong, that worships itself at the expense of everything else, closing itself off from all others in blind solipsism. Peter recalled in an instant all of the occasions when he had told Helen how important the virtue of humility was to him. Every time she had just rolled her eyes dismissively with sneering contempt. Such a wonderful description of your experience of evil. At this moment, something in Peter's demeanour must have altered, signalling his discomfort to Helen. In cold response, she suddenly broke into an evil, gloating smirk, a rictus grin, brimming with malice. Her impish face lit up with hideous glee, sadistically relishing Peter's discomfort. At this additional ghastly sight, Peter's skin crawled, his blood turned to ice in his veins, and he felt nauseous to the pit of his stomach. He shuddered inwardly inwardly with repulsion and disgust. One might expect demons to lash out ferociously, livid with rage, when they were exposed from their hiding place. But the evil entity confronting Peter seemed to exult in its unveiling, with a malicious expression, a beaming, gloating thrill of victory. Peter could hear its thoughts in his head. "Ah, so you finally see me as I truly am. How long it has taken you. How stupidly unobservant. How pitifully slow you've been, you fool. But oh, how much fun I had wrong-footing you all these years, leading you further and further astray, you imbecile, pathetic imbecile." Anyone that's seen behind the narcissist's masks will value the description of the feeling and what you actually see, and the gloating and the joy that the darkness behind the narcissist's mask expresses at finally being able to take the mask off, and the hurt that it's caused you. And then, just as abruptly as it had commenced, the hideous spectacle suddenly vanished. Helen's eyes returned to apparent normality, and she continued with her superficially pleasant chit-chat. The entire freakish episode could not have lasted more than a couple of seconds, even though its significance felt immeasurable to Peter. The conversation continued for another half hour or so without any further drama. Eventually, they finished their coffees, bade each other farewell, and went their separate ways. Neither one of them made the slightest reference to anything out of the ordinary as having occurred. And so, alone again, Peter made his way back to his city residence on foot, which was about a mile away. His mind was distractedly whirling on so many crazy fronts and speculations, dizzy and disorientated as to what had just happened. Suddenly, out of this chaotic mist of confusion, a word swam into the forefront of his mind. Beelzebub. Where on earth had this come from, and what did it mean? He had some notion that it referred to a devil or a demon, but he couldn't pinpoint anything more exact. He hastened his steps towards home, anxious to resolve this quandary spinning in his brain. Entering his flat, he grabbed his laptop and searched online for explanations and etymologies of the obscure word. Almost immediately, he came across the following information. Beelzebub, a Hebrew name derived from the Canaanite god Baal-zebub, god of the Philistine city, Ekron, mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. In Christian theology, Beelzebub is a major demon, often synonymous with Satan, the prince of demons, second only to Lucifer in the hierarchy of hell. Why can't I say some words? In the hierarchy, I think you know what I mean, of hell. He symbolizes pride and tries to lead others into arrogance. The literal translation of Baal-zebub is generally considered to be Lord of the Flies or Lord of the Dunghill, from the Hebrew word zebul, meaning manure. Flies are universally associated with decay, rot, disease, unsanitary conditions, because they breed and feed off and on decaying matter and excrement. With a shudder of horror, Peter dropped his laptop and sank back into his couch, closing his eyes and clasping his face with both hands. He suddenly felt absolutely filthy from head to toe, as if those eyes of dirt had stained and tainted him to the very core of his being. An overpowering urge now shook him, not just to shower and wash himself physically, but to purge and cleanse his innermost soul, confess his sins to any higher power that may deign to listen to his wretched, pitiful testimony. He fervently wished to make amends for every aspect of his life, to atone for any sins or hurt he may have caused to any others. But most of all, he begged to be separated from his birth mother in every possible way, to be made the absolute antithesis of her fallen, misbegotten nature, and to be remade and reborn in an image that was not proud, arrogant, or selfish, but instead humble, gentle, tender, meek, and merciful. Tears welled up in his eyes and rolled down his burning cheeks. As if in answer to his mute plea, a dream he'd had the night before now resurfaced in his mind's eye with utmost vivid clarity. This dream had slipped sublimely out of his immediate focus, and not altogether beyond the reach of his conscious recall. In the dream, he had found himself kneeling at the feet of a figure looking just like the Virgin Mary, clothed in her raiment of blue cloak and white robe. Whether or not it was actually her or someone else, Peter felt no doubt in his heart that the figure was an angelic being. She was a starling, immaculate, beautiful, graceful presence to behold, standing over him in a glimmering golden haze, with both of her arms held out invitingly. Her palms were open and tilted downwards, with her fingers outstretched. Gazing up at her in awe with fearful supplication, he bowed his head in mute adoration to kiss the hem of her flowing white garment. He wondered if he was being sacrilegious, taking liberties, but Mary didn't seem offended by his worshipful gesture. Although he tried to obtain a glimpse of her face, the sheer radiance of golden light shining in all-enveloping aura from her countenance was so strong that no particular detail could be delineated. It was just a blur of gold in a dazzling halo. Instead, he found his attention drawn to both of her hands, which he could see clearly. To his astonishment, he watched dumbfounded as silver beads slowly welled up like tears from beneath the skin of the centre of both her open palms. These beads appeared metallic, but moved like liquid in appearance, similar to mercury or molten silver. As each droplet budded up from beneath her pale skin, it formed itself into a perfectly spherical pearl shape, and then ever so slowly trickled down her hands, before falling freely through space and landing on Peter's scalp, melting imperceptibly into his skin. But each drop seemed to dangle tantalizingly, hanging in midair, almost defying gravity, before descending. Like everything else in the dream, it happened with a hypnotic motion, as if in another worldly hyperdimension, lending an air of added significance to each moment. Somehow, within this transcendental dreamscape, Peter knew that Mary's silver droplets were blessed and infused with a sacred power to heal him, purify him spiritually, consecrate the ground of his wretched soul and spirit, forgive his past misdeeds, and soothe the feelings of guilt and shame that had been haunting him for years. But also, Mary was conferring her divine protection upon him through this ritual act of anointing. And now, in the light of his jarring encounter with his birth mother, Peter saw the surreal but undeniable synchronicity behind it all. In addition to their other blessings, he now realized that it was Mary's silver droplets that had granted him the gift of discernment in the first place. They had coalesced in his mind's eye to form a magic mirror of such powerful reflective ability that his enhanced vision could now penetrate through the most carefully crafted camouflage. As the demon's false image was reflected back on itself by Mary's magic mirror. Its diabolical power was cracked and ended, its spell broken. Following Mary's intervention, Peter was able, for the first time in his life, to see the truth beneath the surface. Still sitting on his couch, he now clasped his hands tightly together, got down on his knees, just like he had done in his dream, and thanked Mary for saving him from the clutches of hell. And we're nearly at the end now to find out what actually happens. This is a very descriptive experience of a spiritual awakening and an understanding an entanglement you may have had with the narcissist and the evil behavior behind the narcissists leeching on to you as a source of supply and ultimately discarding you or trying to destroy you. So it's a wonderfully expressive description of the spiritual awakening of this person. In the ensuing weeks that followed this pivotal event, Peter changed his life drastically. He moved hundreds of miles away from his previous city address, leaving no trace, covering his tracks completely. He resolved firmly not to enter into any further dialogue with the maleficent agent he had encountered. He knew that it would only corrupt, twist and taint his words anyway, to its own crooked benefit and advantage, which is precisely how master manipulators operate, and why they have to be shunned altogether. No contact. So he went no contact with his birth mother. No other choice, no other option was left to him. It was the only way in which he could free himself from the afflictions of his past and protect himself from any future attacks. You must have felt extremely strongly that this was a hugely malignant narcissist that was really dangerous to be with. Several months after this event, following deeper and more sober reflection in his new home in the countryside, which felt like a sanctuary compared to the city that he had just fled from, Peter was once again struck by the undeniable synchronicity of the parallel experiences. The simultaneous encounters with angelic and demonic forces seemed impossible to dismiss as a mere coincidence. On the contrary, he felt that he had been an unwitting pawn in a game of spiritual warfare. Powers infinitely greater than he could ever comprehend had waged war for the fate of his spirit and soul, and he strongly believed that he had been saved from darkness and damnation just in the nick of time. And there we will end your anecdotal evidence of your awakening spiritually and your physical senses helping you decipher what you were strongly feeling in your spiritual energy and your spiritual being. And that, my friend, is wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I hope that resonated with members of our community. Please leave in the comments if you also have had anything like this happen in relation